July 16th, 1944. 3:47 p.m. The temperature inside Barrack 7 hit 104 degrees. The wood walls sweated. The air tasted like rust and sweat and men's breath. Heinrich Muller pressed his back against the bunk frame, trying to find 1 inch of wood that wasn't burning hot. His uniform shirt, the same one he'd worn for 3 weeks, stuck to his skin like wet paper. Around him, 43 other German prisoners did the same desperate calculus. How to survive another Alabama summer day without moving, without thinking, without remembering that 6 months ago, he was eating real food in a real kitchen with his real wife. The youngest boy, Franz, just 18, had stopped asking when they'd get new clothes. His boots had disintegrated into separate pieces. He tied them together with strips torn from his blanket. Every step sounded like walking on broken pottery. This was Camp Aliceville, where the American guards called them krauts, but also shared cigarettes, where they slept behind barbed wire but played volleyball on Sundays, where nothing made sense anymore, especially not what happened next. 3:52 p.m. The bell rang, not the harsh clang of roll call. This was different, musical almost. The men who'd been prisoners longer, the ones who'd stopped flinching at every sound, they sat up. Their faces changed. Something was coming. Something that made grown men who'd survived Stalingrad look like children on Christmas morning. "Ice," whispered Klaus, the former Berlin philosophy professor. His voice cracked. "They're bringing the ice cream." Heinrich's mind couldn't process this. Ice cream in a prison camp while German cities burned. While his family might be dead. While he was sweating through another man's shirt. The contradiction felt violent, obscene, beautiful. The first time, Heinrich had refused it, stood at attention while the other prisoners lined up, watched them take paper cups from American hands. He'd been captured at Normandy, fought those boys on the beaches. Some of them had killed his friends. He'd killed some of theirs. You don't share dessert with your enemy. You don't let them be kind to you. You don't let yourself need their kindness. But that was before he understood. Before he saw Klaus, this man who'd lectured on Kant and Nietzsche. Tears streaming down his face as he tasted vanilla. Before he watched the toughest SS officer in their barrack, a man who never spoke, carefully save half his portion in a tin cup hidden under his bunk. Before he realized that ice cream wasn't ice cream, it was something else entirely, something that broke them open and put them back together different. 4:07 p.m. The truck arrived. Not a military vehicle, a real ice cream truck, white with pictures of cones and sundaes painted on the sides. The American driver, a man named Jimmy who'd never been to war, who'd won the delivery contract in a poker game. He sang while he worked. Show tunes mostly. Today's was Blue Moon. The sound carried across the compound. 43 men in Barrack 7 heard it. 43 men who'd been taught that Americans were subhuman materialists who knew nothing of honor or sacrifice. 43 men who'd believed their own propaganda until this moment. Until they heard Jimmy singing about blue moons while carrying boxes of ice cream toward men who'd tried to kill his countrymen. Heinrich stood. His legs shook. Not from weakness, though he was weak. From something else. The other men were already moving, not rushing, not pushing. Moving like people approaching a religious ceremony. Some removed their caps. Others straightened their torn shirts as if appearance mattered now. As if anything mattered now. The line formed. No guards maintained order. They didn't need to. The men who'd stormed across Europe now waited patiently for paper cups of artificially flavored frozen milk. When Jimmy's assistant, a black man named Samuel who'd grown up under Jim Crow, handed each prisoner their portion. He looked them in the eye, said, "Enjoy it, soldier." Called them soldier, not kraut, not prisoner. Soldier. Heinrich took his place. The cup felt impossibly cold in his hand. His fingers had forgotten this sensation. Vanilla, simple, American. The first bite made his teeth ache. The second made something else ache, something deeper. He was eating ice cream while his country committed atrocities, while his wife might be hiding in cellars, while his unit was probably still fighting somewhere. But also, he was eating ice cream given freely by men who owed him nothing, who defeated him, who could have treated him like the subhuman his country claimed they were, who instead gave him cold sweetness on the hottest day of the year. Klaus stood beside him. The philosophy professor's hands shook as he ate. "You know what this is, Heinrich?" His voice was barely a whisper. "It's mercy without purpose. Mercy is art. They're not doing this to break us for information. They're not doing it because they feel guilty. They're doing it because..." He stopped, took another bite. "Because they believe even your enemy deserves beauty." The word hung in the air. Beauty. In a prison camp. In defeat. In July heat that made thinking impossible. Beauty in the form of cheap vanilla ice cream that probably cost the Americans pennies per serving. Beauty handed out weekly to men who'd lost everything except the capacity to feel this particular pain. The pain of receiving kindness from the enemy. The pain of discovering that everything you'd been taught was a lie. The pain of realizing that the people you'd tried to kill were more human than the system you'd served. Week 3. Heinrich noticed the pattern. The same men who lined up for ice cream on Sunday were the ones who cried in their bunks on Tuesday. Not from homesickness, not from hunger, from something else. From the unbearable weight of contradictions. From understanding that they'd been fighting on the wrong side of humanity. Not the wrong side of the war, that was more complicated. But the wrong side of what humans owed other humans. Franz, the 18-year-old, he broke completely during week 3. Ate his ice cream while tears made tracks through the dirt on his face. Later, Heinrich found him trying to write a letter home. The paper was soaked. The ink ran. Franz looked up and said, "How do I tell my mother that the enemy feeds us better than our own side did? How do I tell her that the Americans treat us like men?" Week 4. The SS officer, the one who never spoke, who'd saved half his portion. He approached Jimmy after distribution, held out something in his hand, a small iron cross, his decoration. Jimmy looked confused. The officer's voice came out rusty, like machinery that hadn't been used. "For your children, when they ask what you did in the war, tell them you gave ice cream to broken men. Tell them that's what victory looks like." Jimmy took the medal. Didn't understand. Couldn't understand. He'd never been to Germany. Never seen what these men had seen. Never done what these men had done. But he took it because you take things when they're offered by men who are crying without making any sound. Week 5. Heinrich began saving half his portion too. Not because he wasn't hungry, he was starving. But because some hungers were deeper than food. He saved it until the compound was dark. Until the other men slept. Until he could taste it slowly, deliberately, like communion. Each bite was a small death and resurrection. Each swallow took away something old and gave something new. He thought about his wife, about the ice cream shop in their village that closed when the war started, about how she'd licked her cone like a child, even in her 30s, about how he'd been embarrassed by her pleasure, about how he'd been embarrassed by pleasure itself, about how the Nazis had taught that pleasure was weakness unless it served the state, about how wrong they'd been, about how the Americans, in their naive, generous, impossible way, were teaching him that pleasure itself could be resistance, that kindness could be warfare, that mercy could destroy a man's worldview more thoroughly than bombs. Week 6. Klaus didn't come to the line. They found him in the barrack, staring at the wall. When Heinrich asked what was wrong, Klaus said, "I figured it out. The ice cream. It's not kindness. It's revelation. They're showing us who we could have been, who we should have been. They're destroying us by showing us our better selves. And the destruction is so gentle, we help them do it." He never came to the line again. But he watched from the window, watched men who'd believed in conquest learn to believe in small mercies, watched boys who'd been taught to hate learn to taste gratitude, watched the slow, deliberate dismantling of everything they'd thought they were. Week 7. The commandant visited, stood beside Jimmy while he served, watched German soldiers, former soldiers, accept American generosity with tears in their eyes. Asked Jimmy why he sang while he worked. Jimmy shrugged. "My mama always said food tastes better when it's served with music. These boys look like they could use every advantage." The commandant, a man who'd seen these prisoners transform from defiant enemies to broken men to something more dangerous, men who'd learned to question everything, asked if Jimmy understood what he was doing. Jimmy smiled. "I'm serving ice cream, sir. Sometimes ice cream is just ice cream, and sometimes it's everything else. But it's always cold and sweet, and these boys always line up for it. That's enough for me." Week 8. Heinrich wrote his first letter home that wasn't censored propaganda. Wrote about the heat, about the boredom, about the ice cream, about how the Americans gave it freely, about how this small act was teaching him more about humanity than all his years of philosophy and training, about how he was beginning to understand that the war had stolen something from everyone, but that mercy could steal it back. He didn't mail the letter. Couldn't. It would have been treason. But writing it changed something. He began watching the guards differently. Not as enemies, not as captors. As men. Young men, mostly. Boys who'd been pulled from farms and cities and given guns. Boys who missed their mothers. Boys who sang while serving ice cream to prisoners because their mamas taught them that kindness was strength. Week 9. Franz approached Samuel, the assistant, asked if he could help next Sunday. Samuel looked at the commandant. Got permission. The next week, Franz helped carry boxes. The week after, he helped serve. By week 11, he was singing too. His voice cracked on the high notes, but Jimmy said that just made it more authentic. The other prisoners watched this transformation with something between terror and hope. If Franz could serve ice cream to his captors, if he could sing while doing it, if he could look grateful while serving men who defeated him, then what else was possible? What other certainties could crumble? What other transformations could happen in the space between defeat and mercy? Week 12. Winter arrived, though winter in Alabama bore no resemblance to winter in Germany. The men still lined up. The ice cream still came. Jimmy still sang. But now there were conversations. Halting, broken, real. The prisoners asked about America. Jimmy told them about baseball and hot dogs and how his grandmother made sweet tea. They told him about German forests and Christmas markets and how their grandmothers made strudel. These conversations were impossible, treasonous, beautiful. They happened in the space between enemy and human, between victor and vanquished. between who these men had been and who they were becoming. They happened over paper cups of vanilla ice cream that cost pennies, but carried the weight of nations learning to see each other. Week 16. Heinrich realized he'd stopped counting weeks, stopped tracking time by Sundays and ice cream, started tracking it by small kindnesses, by moments of recognition, by the slow, deliberate dismantling of the man who'd marched into battle believing in conquest, and the man who now understood that victory sometimes looked like giving your enemy something cold and sweet on a hot day. He thought about the medal the SS officer had given Jimmy, about how Jimmy wore it now on a chain, not understanding its significance, but understanding that it mattered. About how symbols lost their power when humanity intervened. About how the ice cream had done what no military victory could. It had made them question not just their defeat, but their cause, had made them see that the Americans weren't subhuman materialists, but something more dangerous. Humans who believed that even enemies deserved dignity. Week 20. The war news changed. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it. The prisoners listened to secret radios, traded rumors, watched the guards' faces for clues. But still, every Sunday, the truck came. Jimmy sang, Samuel served. The ice cream appeared. It became more than tradition. It became sacrament. A weekly reminder that some things transcended victory and defeat. That mercy had its own logic. That kindness could be subversive. That the Americans were winning the war in ways that had nothing to do with territory or casualties. They were winning by refusing to let war make them less human, by giving ice cream to prisoners while their own boys died on European battlefields, by singing show tunes while serving men who'd probably killed Americans, by being impossibly, irrationally, beautifully generous in ways that made the prisoners question everything they'd fought for. The last Sunday, April 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Everyone knew liberation was coming, though liberation meant different things to different people. For these prisoners, it meant returning to a defeated homeland, to rubble, to shame, to the impossible task of rebuilding when everything they'd believed lay in ruins. Jimmy served the ice cream, sang "We'll Meet Again" instead of his usual show tunes. Samuel looked tired. The prisoners took their portions with the solemnity of men receiving last rites. Because in a way, they were. This was the end of something they'd never expected to experience. The end of learning that your enemy could be more humane than your allies. The end of discovering that defeat could taste like vanilla. The end of understanding that sometimes the most subversive act is treating your enemy like a human being. Heinrich saved his cup. Not to eat later, not as proof, but because he couldn't bear to throw away the last one. Because paper cups and cheap ice cream had taught him more about humanity than all the philosophy he'd studied, all the propaganda he'd believed, all the battles he'd fought. Because he knew that when he returned to Germany, if he returned, he would carry this memory like a wound and a blessing. The memory of Americans who gave ice cream to prisoners, who sang while they served, who destroyed their enemies by being kind to them, who showed them that the real war wasn't between nations, but between the capacity for mercy and the capacity for cruelty. And that mercy, improbably, beautifully, had won. Week 21. The prisoners left, not all at once, in groups, in chaos, in the confusion of victory and defeat and what came after. Heinrich was in the second group. He said goodbye to Jimmy, thanked him. Jimmy shrugged. It was just ice cream, soldier. Just ice cream. But they both knew it wasn't. It was everything ice cream could never be. It was transformation served in paper cups. It was defeat that tasted like mercy. It was enemies learning to see each other across barbed wire and artificial flavors, and the impossible, beautiful, devastating realization that sometimes the people you tried to kill treat you more humanely than the people you tried to serve. Heinrich carried that knowledge home, carried it through the ruins of Germany, through the rebuilding, through the rest of his life. Sometimes, when he tasted vanilla, real vanilla, not the artificial kind, he thought about Alabama heat and American kindness and how the most effective weapon in that particular war wasn't a weapon at all. It was mercy. It was music. It was ice cream on Sunday afternoons when the temperature hit 104 degrees, and grown men wept over paper cups of cold sweetness that cost pennies, but carried the weight of nations, learning that even enemies deserve beauty.